and welcome to India Speak, the Center for Policy Research's podcast. April 21st is celebrated in India as Civil Services Day, a day to commemorate India's steel frame and celebrate the important contribution that India's civil service plays and continues to play in nation building. But the Indian civil services, particularly the All India Civil Services, and perhaps most notably the Indian Administrative Service, has in recent decades been at the heart of a sense of deep disenchantment that the Indian public has towards the Indian state. Much has been talked about the criticality of reform of the civil services, and the argument that has been repeatedly presented in public discourse is that the Indian civil services, and particularly the IAS as it's organized, is in fact not structured to respond to the complexity of 21st century public policy making. There have, over the years, been many serious academic work undertaken by civil services officers and public administration researchers studying the civil services and debating the direction in which reform should take place. Two seminal chapters were written over the decades of 2000s and the 2010s by two of India's finest civil servants, T.V. Somanathan and KP Krishnan, in two edited volumes of a book edited by Devesh Kapoor, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, called Public Institutions in India. The second volume brought in Milan Vaishnav as a third editor, titled King Public Institutions. And in both these volumes, KP Krishnan and T.V. Somanathan wrote important chapters detailing the nature and the character of the All India services as they were envisaged in the Constitution, identifying the critical shifts that have taken place in the civil services, and building on that, articulating some of the key areas which need to be reformed and the direction that debates and action on civil service reforms should take. It is a real privilege for India Speak to run a special series that unpacks these two chapters and also updates the discourse on civil service reforms. And there couldn't be a better day to start this series than Civil Services Day. I'm Yamini Aiyar, and it's a privilege for me to welcome Dr. KP Krishnan, who is now retired from the Indian Administrative Services and is an Honorary Research Professor at the Center for Policy Research. We will, over the course of the next four episodes of India Speak, discuss the framework that Dr. Krishnan and T.V. Somanathan built to understand the civil services, the shifts that have been underway, and the direction that the debate on reform has taken, ought to take, and what action should look like. So I hope you'll join us, listeners, through this series. Today, the first episode will really focus much more on the structure of the All India services as it was envisaged at our founding moment, and a focus on the kind of big structural shifts that have been underway in the character and structure of the All India services. Dr. Krishnan, thank you very much for joining us on our podcast. Let me start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the actual structure of the Indian civil services as was articulated in the Constitution. In our popular imagination, and often many of our informed public debates on civil service reforms, it's become almost part of the narrative to say the starting point of the problem with the civil services in India is that we inherited a colonial structure of the civil services, or the colonial structure of the ICS, which then became the IAS. So it was really a name change rather than a restructuring of the civil services to be responsive to the needs of a modern nation. Prime Minister Modi himself has recently said we are trying to solve 21st century problems with a 19th century administration. But I think the starting point of your work on the Indian civil services tells us a little bit about the thought that went behind the constitutional design of the Indian administrative services, the Indian civil services for independent India, which in some senses tells us that there was an evolution and an imagination behind what the design and structure of civil services should be like for a modern nation. So can we start there?
Thank you, and greetings, Yamini. Let me first thank you for this opportunity, and I think it's a great privilege to be doing this podcast. To straight away get into the question that you posed, we bring out very clearly in the Civil Service Paper 1. As you rightly said, there are two papers. The first one is almost 20 years old, and the second one is about 7-8 years old. The second one was a revision of the first, sort of an updation of the elements of the first. In Civil Service 1, my colleague T.V. Somanathan and I elaborate quite a bit on what we call the initial design. In the manner that you put it, the paper is structured in a particular manner, but focusing on the initial design, we believe is important because an evaluation of what the civil service does or what the civil service did should be with reference to its design and the expectations from the civil service. So what we do in the chapter, in the section dealing with initial design is, A, you need to look at various articles of the Constitution. And this is an important point because we are among the few constitutions that actually explicitly deal with the civil service and in particular with the All India service. But we say that you should not, sort of look at one article of the Constitution. You have to read a number of articles of the Constitution together. Plus, keep in mind the Planning Commission documents as a proxy for the thinking of the polity on what it expects the civil service to do in the emerging India, in its role in economic development or in social activities. So the point that we bring out in that context is, if you look at the plan documents, there is a big role for the state in the economy, and therefore the civil service is being talked about in the plan documents as a development agent. So it's not a passive implementer of legislations alone, but an activist development agent. 3, we make the point that social legislations to bring about social change, unlike the bureaucracy of the past, which in a sense kept away from contentious, quote unquote, domestic social issues, here is a bureaucracy which is explicitly being mandated to become a social change agent, because one of the explicit purposes of the Constitution and the plan documents is to redefine the social order by proactive use of state power. So this is a bureaucracy which is fundamentally different from, quote unquote, the bureaucracy that we inherited. So I think in terms of the roles that were envisaged, it's a very different bureaucracy. In terms of the roles that were sort of carved or created for it in terms of its place in the Constitution and law, it's a very different bureaucracy. Now, I think it is in this context that those initial design features, which we sort of I won't say implicit, but we derive the roles from the Constitution and the Planning Commission and related documents that become important. Those 5 or 4 features that we believe are the defining features of the initial design.
And these design features are distinctive to what is now the Indian Civil Services, the All India Services. So can you tell us a little bit about the key design features as you pull them together through your understanding of the Constitution and the plan documents?
So we make this point early on in the paper that dealing with the entire civil service is actually a huge task, because India has, I think, last count, something like 66 or 67 organized civil services at the union level. There are specialist services that deal with military engineering. There are specialist services that deal with architecture. But we confine ourselves to the union bureaucracy. Within that, we confine ourselves to actually the All India services, and within that, in reality, to the Indian Administrative Service, not only because it's important, clearly it is important given the nature of the design, but also because we wanted to deal with something which is, which one can deal with in the length of a paper. So subject to that limitation, whatever else I am now going to say is largely confined to All India services, more specifically the Indian Administrative Service, though the Indian Administrative Service, the Indian Police Service, and the Indian Forest Service, all three flow from the same article of the Constitution, the same legislation, All India Services related acts of Parliament. Now, the features that I think are critical and which are a clear, at least four of them are a clear departure from what we inherited. All India, not only in name, but in character, by design. And I'll explain, depending on time, what we mean by this. Number two, dual control by the union and the state government. Now, this is clearly a feature which is not only peculiar to India, it is a fundamental departure from what existed prior to the creation of the IAS. This question didn't arise in British India. It's a question which was very relevant when we were framing our constitution, and surprisingly, probably a question which is even more relevant today. As a polity, as a federal polity, this business of dual control by the union and the states. 3, selection purely on merit. This perhaps was true of the ICS. I'm sure it was true of the ICS. 4, an associated sort of aspect by an apolitical authority formally outside the political/administrative control of government. And the last feature, which is something we derive, which is not explicit, but we derive it as an implicitly important feature of the new design, and which flows in a sense from the dual control, is the protection from arbitrary punishment. These 5 features are, to our mind, important parts of the initial design, and which is a departure from the predecessor service.
So let's tackle each one so that we understand this better, because if we don't get the design right, then we can't understand why they have or haven't been deviations and what were the limitations of these designs. So let me start with the All India character. You say that the IAS was specifically designed as an All India, with an All India character. Could you explain what that means? And also for our listeners, the everyday life of the bureaucracy that we encounter comes through our encounters with the district magistrate. And then there's this whole thing called a state cadre. So if you can just explain what is the distinction between the All India services, the state cadre, and specifically the All India character that you're describing, it'll help us locate the design and structure of the All India services a little better.
The 3 services that I mentioned, the Indian Administrative Service, the Indian Police Service, and the Indian Forest Service, constitute at present the 3 All India services. The 3 All India services are, in a very mechanical sense, the definition would be recruited by the Union Public Service Commission with the union government, namely the Department of Personnel, in the case of IAS, the Department of or the Home Ministry in the case of the IPS, and the Ministry of what is now called Environment and Forests in the case of Indian Forest Service, playing the administrative sort of backup role, but selection by the Union Public Service Commission, content, syllabus, exam, recruitment process entirely in the hands of a constitutional body, but numbers for a particular year. How are vacancies to be calculated? A lot of that handled by the union government departments that I mentioned in consultation with the states. But most important, high likelihood that, not high likelihood, in sort of actuality, a bulk of the 3 All India service officers, though recruited by the union agency, would serve their entire lifetime, perhaps serving the state government. They are allocated, once the selection takes place, a process of allocation of the officer to a state cadre happens. And that is a combination of the choice of the candidate, availability of vacancies, and a certain roster in terms of how many insiders and how many outsiders will constitute a particular year's batch. So an officer is recruited, allocated to a state, and that officer then is an officer of the state, unlike an income tax officer or a customs officer or an Indian Information Service officer, who is an officer of the union government, or what we more popularly, colloquially call the central government.
Can I ask you to explain this a little bit more? What is the distinction between being an officer of the state versus an officer of the union, in the sense that how do the lines of accountability actually work? So who do you report to? Who does your performance monitoring, or what all of you IS talk about the ACR, the confidential reports, and what are those relationships between the state government and the union government? Another related question, you spoke about the allocation to the states, and you said that there is a balancing act that is made between insiders versus outsiders. What was the strategic thinking behind that? So we understand, how is it that state governments are actually populated with an executive?
When I said that an All India Service officer serves the state government, what I mean is, if you go back to the 7th schedule of the Constitution and look at the allocation of powers, there is a certain set of subjects called the union list subjects. There are state list subjects, list 2, and there is the concurrent list subject. And there are legislations that are made by the union parliament, state legislatures, and legislations that fit into the concurrent list. An officer allocated to the state serves in the state government. For instance, the positions that you mentioned, district magistrate of Vijayawada, or deputy commissioner of Jalandhar, or deputy commissioner of a district in Jammu and Kashmir. All these are positions that are part of the state government, reporting to the state administrative hierarchy, eventually to the state chief minister. So the officer recruited by the union system, allocated to the state, serves the state government, starting as subdivisional magistrate, and then becoming additional district magistrate, and becoming district magistrate. Likewise, functioning in urban local bodies of the state, rural panchayati raj bodies of the state, and in state government departments. Registrar of Cooperatives, Commissioner Food and Civil Supplies of Jammu and Kashmir, or in charge of women and child development in the state of Andhra Pradesh. So these are all positions in the state government serving the people of that state to which you are allotted, your entire hierarchy is within the state government. Your immediate bosses are in the state government. Your political executive, which is supervising you, which is recording what you call famous annual confidential reports, are all done within the state government. So, in that sense, this officer is entirely an officer of the state government, which is different from the income tax officer recruited by the same Union Public Service Commission in the same exam, allocated, let's say, to the income tax service. He or she may physically be working in Vijayawada, but he is carrying out functions under a legislation called the Income Tax Act or a few other additional legislations, all of which are list 1 legislations reporting to a hierarchy ending with the finance minister of India in the union government. He may be a junior functionary, but his entire hierarchy is in the union government. That is the distinction.
I think this is really important for us to understand, because in a sense, the federal dynamic of the country was very much embedded into the design of the All India services. And as you describe in your essay as well, it is the union government that has to borrow in some senses, or specifically have officers deputed from the states to the center, so that state needs are represented in policy making that takes place at the center, in the central government. So could you tell us a little bit more about how that dynamic works? So once when an officer is in the state, how does this whole cadre deputation process work? And your reflections on its effectiveness over the last 30-40 years, because when you walk down the corridors of Krishi Bhavan and Shastri Bhavan, often you hear only one particular language, and it does seem like certain states tend to be represented more than others, just offhand. But to understand a little bit better how this federal balance was meant to be achieved and where we are today.
Thanks. That's an interesting question. And let me start with something which you will not find in the paper, which is an anecdote, I believe, attributed to Madam Mrs. Gandhi. There is I remember people in Delhi in the mid-70s telling me that there was this famous minister called P.C. Sethi. He was originally Madhya Pradesh person. I mean, he was chief minister of Madhya Pradesh. Then he became minister for, I think, chemicals, fertilizers, what used to be then, I think, petroleum, chemicals, and fertilizers. And he apparently was insistent on a particular officer who had worked with him as his secretary in the state government or his district magistrate to be posted as secretary or a senior officer in his ministry. Mrs. Gandhi is supposed to have famously remarked that this is the union government, and precisely the point that you made, namely, in the union government, you need the equivalent of different languages. To illustrate, if there is a joint secretary dealing with, let's say, agricultural insurance, and the Union of India legislatively is mandated to deal with the question of insurance because it's a list 1 subject. But if you are designing a crop insurance program for India, clearly you need to take note of Assam agriculture, which is going to be very different in character from Punjab agriculture, which in turn will be very different in character from Tamil Nadu or XYZ state. So, how does one get the variety that India is in union policy making, union legislation making? So to come back to the Mrs. Gandhi episode, she apparently advised Mr. P.C. Sethi on file that from now on, I shall insist that the union minister in charge of a subject and the secretary, number 2, the key joint secretaries and additional secretaries in that ministry cannot be from the same state/same state cadre. So she advised Mr. P.C. Sethi that Mr. Sethi, You cannot take a Madhya Pradesh officer, and I believe as a result, Mr. K.V. Ramanathan was appointed as secretary of that ministry on the ground that since you are from the north, I insist that an officer who can't even speak Hindi fluently from Tamil Nadu will be the secretary, because collectively you and 4 joint secretaries from 4 other states will then get an all India picture. So when you then write the fertilizer policy or the subsidy policy for fertilizer, you don't only do a policy for rice, you do a policy for states which grow millets. And the whole design of the original Sardar Patel design of this all India in character was, you gain experience of ground reality, state reality by being an officer of the state. But the union at its top level actually does not have a bureaucracy of its own, which is a remarkable feature of, I think, only this polity. The top echelons of the union bureaucracy are entirely borrowed. There is not one senior most officer or senior level officer in the Union of India who actually belongs to a central government service.
I'm going to deviate a little bit, but come back to this point because I think it's so important. Whenever we, in our public discourse, in frustration with the civil services, particularly in, when one thinks of the IAS, one is often thinking of Ministry of Finance, of Krishi Bhavan, of Shastri Bhavan, South Block, North Block. This frustration with the ability of the generalist civil service to be responsive to the complexities of a 21st century economy. And we fall into talking about the lateral entry as a prospect and possibility to get past many of these generalist challenges that we see as, I'm talking about public discourse. There's lots to unpack even in this statement, which I hope we'll do over the course of this series. But what we've never discussed, there's been a lot of vibrant debate about lateral entry and its value, generalist versus specialist, but I have rarely heard anyone talk about what this element of diversity of India that we will lose if we do put, or what impact rather lateral entry may have on this diversity, which was so inherent to the design of the Indian Constitution. So I just wanted you to reflect on that. I know there's lots of other aspects of lateral entry that we will come back to, but just on this diversity point, because it's very rare to hear this being discussed in the context of what the civil services is by design.
Thanks. I think that's an important point. And let me first answer that by reference, with reference to a point we make in Civil Service 1. Civil Service 2 explicitly talks about lateral entry, but Civil Service 1 makes an interesting point, which is, if you see the design of the IAS cadre of a particular state, and this brings me to that early question that you had on, you have an IAS, and you have something called the State Civil Service. Can you unpack this? I will relate all of these in this answer. Let's say the state of Karnataka. And let's say there is a number 250. And this is an arbitrary number. The actual number could be 288, 300. I'm not entirely current on this. There is something called the complete cadre strength of the state of Karnataka. That is the total number of IAS officers that has been worked out as the requirement of the state of Karnataka. The way this is worked out is, there are a bunch of posts that have been notified as cadre posts that will necessarily be manned by, perhaps that is gender incorrect, that will be womaned by, personed by. Thanks. I am learning. So that are personed by officers of the Indian Administrative Service, for instance, district magistrates, commissioners of division, some heads of departments. So once that number is arrived at, based on that, a series of other calculations take place, which basically are standard principles of any personnel management. A certain percentage of people will be on leave. a certain percentage of people will want to go on training, and the all India character. A certain percentage of Karnataka should necessarily be serving in the affairs of the union. How else does Karnataka's viewpoint get reflected in the union? And how else does union get the diversity that I stated earlier to be a desirable objective? So the union number is known. We have X number of secretaries, Y number of joint secretaries, X number of available or whatever, A number of directors. So each state contributes a certain number, which is called the Central Deputation Reserve, and so on. So you arrive at the cadre strength of the state. But keeping in mind the need for sufficiently rooted cadres, the original design envisaged by Sardar Patel had a couple of additional features worked into this. Given that the initial allotment will place an officer at field positions, subdivisional magistrate, district magistrate, who would be implementing what? A bunch of legislations relating to land, relating to society. And remember, we were fundamentally changing the social order. We were passing land reform legislations. We were passing temple entry legislations. We were passing what was then called the Untouchability Offences Act legislation. Expectation was the local officialdom will necessarily be drawn into conflict with the local elites, because that is the social order that you are going to be attacking and changing. That elite is likely to have influence over the state hierarchy. State hierarchy should not have, therefore, the ability to punish this young, enthusiastic subdivisional magistrate or district magistrate, and hence dual control. Union of India controls major punishments, but there is an assumption of enlightened state political leadership, which will allow this district magistrate to do a lot of the social engineering, the social legislations that are being envisaged. But again, the pragmatist that he was, Sardar Patel realized that you also need local character, localization, for want of a better phrase. So first you took care of non-partisan, neutral people by inducting large number of external or outsiders to the state into the IAS, but you balance it with promoting officers of the state civil service into the IAS cadre of the state. Collectively, this constitutes the IAS of the state. But, and here is the interesting catch, in addition to the state civil service, there is in the initial design a cadre for selection of experts. You could have a doctor from the state health service. You could have a public works engineer. You could have a state development department person inducted into the IAS following the process prescribed, which involves the UPSC. The suggestion we made in Civil Service 1 was, this allows you with a little bit of, we were not even sure if it required, maybe it required an amendment. With a bit of legislative change, you could actually induct experts into the selection category and yet integrate into the good feature of the IAS, namely retention of state union balance and retention of diversity. Because the expertise that you want in agriculture in the union ministry is not merely Punjab agriculture or UP agriculture. You also need Assam agriculture. If you remember, one of the most successful commissioners of agriculture in the Union Agriculture Ministry was one of my seniors called Dr. T. Sampath. He is former Director Agriculture of Karnataka. Now, he is an agricultural scientist who has done remarkable work in dryland agriculture as well as wetland agriculture and millets agriculture, because Karnataka is all of these. He was Commissioner Agriculture, Government of India. So it is not that we've not been able to induct expertise, but I'm not saying this is the only method, but I think this is an interesting and a sort of an available method for integrating the good values that were part of the initial design of the IAS and yet inducting expertise.
Thanks for that. I think that's a really important corrective to how we've understood the civil service, how we've understood its design, how we've understood the relationship between the center and the state and the IAS. And in our next discussion, we will talk about whether that original design has actually been fulfilled over the course of the many decades since. But let me ask you one related and question. You know, in your last response to describing the initial design and why diversity but with distance needed to be maintained within the civil services, particularly given the specific role that was envisaged in terms of shifting and changing social order. In a sense, then, it was expected and almost necessary that the civil services by design be somewhat distanced from the social context in which it was located. Would that be a fair thing to say? That if the role that the district magistrate, the sub-district magistrate had to play in terms of land, shifting social order, temple entry, as you mentioned, and we needed to ensure that there was a degree of political neutrality and protection from elites. By design, you talked about the union and the state be playing that role. But is that why also the need for a very clearly defined merit-based selection process was necessary, because it was expected that that role of social change will take place through an interaction between elites and the local state cadres? I'm speculating here, but trying to understand, because in our perception and experience of what it means to interact with the bureaucracy at the local level, that distance is very visible. It's visible in the Lal Batti Ka Gadi. It's visible in the colonial homes in which many of the DMs live, especially in parts of North India. We wanted to try and understand whether retaining that distance was part of the design.
That's an interesting question. You know, I'm reminded of this phrase that I often hear from my friends. I'm by training also a lawyer. A lot of my friends went into the practice of law and have gone into the judiciary. In the earlier days, and when we were studying law, we would often hear this phrase called judicial aloofness. And I think there is fundamentally some merit to that idea. And rather than calling it, distance, distance is perhaps a neutral word. I don't think I have a quarrel with that. I don't think it's just the idea of an elite. I think if you have to be, quote unquote, presiding over a dispute as a judge, then I think justice demands that you are not drawn into non-judicial conversations and discussions on that topic, because clearly those will influence you, whatever be the strength of your character. Subconsciously, a conversation on the merits of a case with somebody who is likely to be interested in that case will prejudice the judge. I think it is in that sense that this Sardar Patel design, that the legislations that require implementation without fear or favor, and very often at the expense of the current social elite, was, I think, an important consideration in the distancing of the district magistrate from, quote unquote, the locals. So people make fun of this concept called an officers club. I think the officers club idea is not so much elitism, or very often the officers club, in Tumkur district where I was a probationer, or in Dharwad district, which I have seen, used to be a very poor carbon copy of the more elite city club,
Delhi Gymkhana Club.
yeah, which used to be patronized by the local businessmen, the local landlords who had much more money. This would be, club was a misnomer. This was a building which had a carom board, and where there would be at most a badminton court, and if you were lucky, a tennis court. And the officers would show up there primarily because you could interact without fear that at the end of the conversation, somebody would say, "Sir, my arms license is pending with you. Will you please clear it?" As a different context, as somebody said, you can't say no to the guy with whom you've just had a drink, or some equivalent of that. So I think some of the design was keeping in mind the fact that India required this field officer to certainly be not easily approachable, because the only ones who would be able to approach him are the elites, the local elites, who had a lot to lose by implementation of the legislations that he or she was charged with. So I think that is the context in which I would sort of understand those. I'm not necessarily making a case for those today, but I'm trying to explain, what existed. And I think it had an internally consistent logic to it at that point in time.
No, absolutely. I think through the course of our conversations, I hope that we can unpack the relevance of some of these design issues in the contemporary. But this brings me to the last two design features that you mentioned. One, I think we've touched upon it in different ways through this conversation, the relevance of political neutrality. And in some ways, that relevance of political neutrality sort of led to the infamous Article 311, which was meant to provide legal protection to civil servants. And again, something that in public discourses are often beaten with a stick, because that's seen as one of the reasons why you have quote unquote inefficiency, apathy, lethargy within the civil services. After all, if no one can fire you, why would you bother doing your job, as all the good economists will tell you about incentives. So just to hear your reflections on that, and then related but somewhat different, this whole idea of a very clearly defined merit-based elite selection process, which is in so many ways just dominated the imagination of the youth of India across many decades. But you just have to go to Kota, you have to go to Patna, and it is that UPSC exam. And I'm still convinced that the best place to teach public policy in India is not in these public policy schools, it is in the coaching centers, because that's where our future public policy actors are actually learning. But just for your reflections on those two critical design features before we close today's series.
Let me start first with Article 311. And if you've noticed, in Civil Service 1, we discuss Article 311 in the section dealing with arbitrary punishment. Yeah. And there is a reason why we do that. And Somanathan and I debated this quite a bit before we actually placed it where we did it. The reason is, if you actually unpack Article 311, what does it promise? It actually promises it mandates two procedural safeguards. Number one, the officer will be informed of the charges, which are the reasons for the proposed punishment. I mean, this is as basic as audi alteram partem. It's fundamental principle of natural justice that if X is being punished, X needs to be aware of the charges as to why he is being punished. I'm sure no one, even the most seasoned economists that you did not quote, will dispute that. Point two, it has an interesting second requirement that the punishment shall not be and it categorizes a set of punishments, not all punishments, the truly major punishments like dismissal. The serious punishments cannot be awarded by an authority lesser than the appointing authority. Now, it sounds like mumbo jumbo, but let's go back to dual control. If your appointing authority is the President of India, the Union Public Service Commission recommends a list. The list comes to the Union Ministry of Personnel and Training, which all executive action in India is by order and in the name of the President of India. So the IAS officer or the All India Service officer is appointed by the President of India. Therefore, he or she cannot be dismissed by an authority lower than the President of India. In other words, again, let's go back to the initial design. If you are implementing social legislation and given the high likelihood that the service will get into conflict with dominant political interests in the state, who will have ability to influence the state polity and who will be able to get punishments inflicted, the insulation from politics required that you cannot inflict the ultimate punishment of dismissal. The state that is unhappy, and do you remember those episodes about the Gaya Mahant who had 12,000 acres of land in various benamis and a series of district magistrates who tried implementing the most progressive land reform legislations in India, if you recall, originated in Bihar. District magistrates who were trying to implement them, each of them would sooner or later bite the dust because they were against very powerful, dominant local interests. But you could not dismiss them because of Article 311. The state government could transfer them, could suggest a punishment of a high order, but the high order punishment necessarily needs to come to the union, which means to the Union Public Service Commission and to the Union Ministry of Personnel. So Article 311 is inherent in the 5-feature design. So procedural safeguard in terms of natural justice and avoiding this state-inflicted punishment when you run into conflict with local elites, local power elites, was the design on the punishment part. On your merit-related question, clearly, I think we may have disagreement on what constitutes merit and is knowing the precise sentence in the logo of the LIC. Merit is, I think, a million rupee question. Given that LIC is being privatized, it's probably $1 billion question. Well, that's the worth of LIC.
And given how important life insurance is, it probably is a good thing to know what LIC is.
So, if you move away from this question of, is UPSC's definition of merit the right definition? No one even questioning this will dispute that it's a fair exam. It's mindless maybe, but those episodic question paper leaks related incidents, mercifully only 1 or 2 of them apart, no one disputes that it's a fair exam. And it's got, I think, what you call a type 2 error. A lot of bright kids may not make it, but by and large, the kids who make it, I'm not sure if they're kids anymore, the people who make it are people of this definition of merit is not in dispute. So I think the question that we need to ask today is, why is there such a premium on this job? You know, for 100 positions, or today I think probably 50 positions, open merit positions in the Indian Administrative Service, probably 5.5, 6 lakh, 7 lakh people are competing. And in that sense, I couldn't agree more with you. It's a huge waste of national resource at the prime of somebody's youth. But I think interesting questions to bite into in our second conversation.
Absolutely. And just this sort of relates to just one last thing, because I know we're going to have to come back to this as we unpack. In the original design, the expectation was through this process, you would capture bureaucrats young, and they would then rise through the course of their careers in the service. So the age of entry was an important part of thinking about the examination process and the selection process. And over time, of course, that too has evolved. But just if you could say a word on that, because I know we'll come back to it in our later conversations.
Yeah, in fact, in our paper, we talk about explicit changes in design which moved away from the initial design. And two changes that we highlight: A, the increased proportion from the state services. This has not been fully understood by a lot of observers, but the increasing provincialization of the state cadre. It sounds a little paradoxical. The original design, when you say all India in character, it is not only the union government that needs to be all India. The design was the state government also needs to be all India, because the state government is an important part of the Union of India.
Yeah.
So the increasing provincialization of the state cadre of the IAS completely goes against the initial design. And the second feature, which was explicitly changed, in fact, the second feature is two sets of sub features: age limit, number of attempts. If merit was an important part of the initial design, and it indisputably was, I think the number of attempts and increasing the age limit both have fundamentally affected this initial design, because besides merit, the design also had a very strong element of idealism. Youths at 21, straight from college, and it wasn't meant to be a person who has worked for 4 years in XYZ IT firm, 3 years in state government, 1.5 years in one more civil service, and at 32 with a family entering as a subdivisional magistrate is not the original design. Now, you could argue that there is nothing wrong with this change, but I think the point I'm making is it is not part of the initial design, and the initial design and the objectives of the civil service were inextricably linked. So to that extent, a departure from the initial design would mean less effectiveness and therefore less outcomes of the kind that you had in mind originally.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krishnan, for walking us through this really, really important part of something that is actually missing in our analysis, understanding, and public debates on civil service reforms. The original design and the inextricable link between the original design and the goals and objectives of what the civil service was expected to do in those early years of our founding movement, as defined in the Constitution. Over the course of our next few conversations, we hope to unpack this a lot more. Where did we go from this original design of the all India character, of dual control, of merit-based selection, of political neutrality, to the current contemporary moment, where essentially I think the one thing that all Indians will agree on, despite deep political polarization of the moment, is that we need to urgently reform our civil services. We'll get to that in our next few episodes. Thank you. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and on our website www.cprindia.org.